Welcome to Leadership English, the best resource for professionals who are non-native speakers. My name is Tanya Suarez, and as your leadership communication coach, I'm here to help you speak English clearly and confidently. In today's episode, you're going to see me interview one of my clients, Arati Maleku. She's going to share with us her journey from Nepal to becoming an associate professor at Ohio State University. Her journey is full of experiences that you've probably gone through, everything from culture shocks in America to communication challenges. After you enjoy the interview, make sure you head over to tanyasuarez.com/lead and download my free audio training, where you get to learn the 3 essentials of American leadership communication. So thank you so much for joining us today. Can you please introduce yourself to us?
Thank you, Tanya. My name is Arati Maleku. I am currently an associate professor with the Ohio State University College of Social Work.
Impressive. And can you tell us a little bit about your journey, your background? Where are you from? When did you move to the U.S.?
Absolutely. I am originally from Nepal, and I came to the U.S. in 2002 as an international student, and I cannot believe it's been almost 22 years.
Time flies. Now, at that point, how proficient were you in English?
I mean, in Nepal, I thought I was very proficient in English because we learned English in school, part of the curriculum from an early age. So, but once I got here, sort of like feeling like myself in English, it's taken a while, and I think it's still been an ongoing process. It has taken time to feel comfortable, and I would say I'm still adapting, but I do want to say that I've reached a point where I've also started to think in English, which is surprisingly, again, I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, impacted my ability to speak Nepali very fluently.
Interesting.
I know it's more comfortable to speak in English, especially in formal situations than Nepali. Conversation in Nepali, I think I do okay, but if I'm asked to give a formal speech or, then it gets a bit difficult. And I think might be with education and professional career. So that shift has been both fascinating and challenging as I sort of navigate these 2 languages. I do want to, though, add that I think in English, but my dreams often are still in Nepali. And then if there are times when it's stressful, I still go back to Nepali as well. So what I found was, thinking in English, but it really suggests that have sort of become a little more proficient in English, but you still have these deep-rooted cultural linguistical ties, right, to Nepali that remain strong, which is great. And often, as they say, like dreams often reflect our subconscious mind, really
Speaking like a true academic.
all of that. So it's this duality, I think, is very interesting, and I guess it just highlights the complex and ongoing process of navigating between like different languages and cultures.
For sure. And I feel like for me in my dreams, it depends on who else is with me in the dreams. My language adapts to who else is featured.
That is true. That is true. No, I can totally relate to that.
Right? Like if my mom's in my dream, it's in Spanish. If my wife is in my dream, it's in English. So it changes depending on, it accommodates the guest.
Right. No. I can totally relate to that. Yes.
But you know what? I'm glad that you said what you mentioned before about there are certain things that you're even now more comfortable in English, because I feel the same way. I feel like conversationally, I'm super comfortable in Spanish. But if I had to go on stage and talk about my career or my work, I would feel a lot more comfortable in English.
And also the technical jargons and that
Yes.
we use a lot in our careers and fields. And so it just makes it difficult to translate that into a different language.
So you mentioned that you moved to the U.S. for college. So do you remember what were some of the first culture shocks of being in them? It could be language or American culture in general.
Absolutely. I think I still go through some of those cultural shocks. On a positive side, I was pleasantly surprised by how people were so friendly and open. Like strangers often greeting one another to start conversations. Indeed, it felt welcoming, and but it did get some time getting used to that. Professionally, I was surprised by a very direct communication style, more straightforward. I think some of the funny moment is when, you first encounter with American sarcasm, sort of jokes, and I couldn't tell if people were serious or joking. Um,
Because of like the tone, you're like,
I was like, well, was he serious? Was he joking? Like, so and I think there's still times when I don't completely understand.
sarcasm is tricky.
It's been a journey of learning and adapting, and also like sort of like finding humor in the unexpected. I think, yeah, sometimes I don't understand, and it's okay.
Humor is hard because it's not
It's hard.
language, it's then the country and the region, because there are some regional jokes that people will use in the Midwest that aren't used as often in the South, or things of that nature, where you really have to know the culture. And what would you say, getting used to difference in culture and the communication culture? Like you mentioned, people are super friendly in person or in casual settings, but really direct in the business or more formal settings. What were some communication challenges that, as you got into your career, you faced?
I'm a researcher. As an academic, we have this interpersonal communication, right? When it relates to workplace and all of that. But then there's also this written communication, and we teach a lot. I sort of have developed this strong knack for writing, and I always have felt I'm better at writing than speaking, because I think in academic writing, it's more about structure and clarity, all those things. But interpersonal communication can be challenging when you sort of are navigating cultural differences, again, interpreting nonverbal cues, understanding jokes and all of that. So that I think was challenging. It was more easier for me to write than to speak. And so, even when conveying very complex ideas in writing is much more easier for me than expressing them clearly and confidently in face-to-face interactions, because, as we learned in the coaching, it's also the cultural aspects tied to this. And we have our own limitations in terms of in our head, right? Like how might my accent be perceived by people, or one of those things. I think
you're juggling so many insecurities in addition to the content that you want to share.
Right. So we sort of create our own limitations. So I think interpersonal communication definitely was challenging, but it has taken a while. And I think the coaching elevated some of the strengths. So, you just have to like sort of continue to learn, be very curious, compassionate with yourself. And
well, interesting you should say that. Because you are super critical of yourself.
I know I am critical, but at the same time, I have learned in the right trajectory. I've sort of learned to be very open, and continue to learn these things. I think that taking the coaching was at the right time when I was already in that upward trajectory of sort of embracing my own language skills with its own strengths and weaknesses.
Right. I'm so glad that I caught you during that time of life. But that's for other people who are, because I feel like a lot of people that follow me and that I work with are also, I think it's because I am super critical of myself that reflects and attracts a certain personality. So what would you say to someone who is in that moment of being hypercritical? I get that it gets us to a certain point, but now that you've experienced and experimented with being more compassionate, what would you say is the result or the difference that you see in your communication evolution?
That's a very good question. I think it's very important to be patient and persistent. I know I'm sort of hard on myself, but at the same time, you have to recognize that, adapting to a new language, culture, it takes time, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but trying to also understand what you bring in, like some of the strengths, unique background, offers very valuable insights. So I think that is important. So not only it's good to have some good expectations of yourself, but over time, I have learned that it's also extremely important to be compassionate with yourself. So practicing self-compassion, I think, is important.
And I think my goal with that is, of course, it would be great that we all love ourselves and all that. But in addition to that, in terms of the business results, I find that when you do lead with compassion for yourself, and like you said, being persistent, but also being patient, it really helps with decreasing anxiety. And when you're not in that anxious state, the fluency, the clarity, your executive presence, I find is easier to tap into. Have you found that to be your experience as well?
Absolutely. So it always felt like you have anxiety about a particular job role, whatever you're doing, and then there's this language anxiety. So if you sort of can balance, but feeling a little more calmer, giving yourself time to think, I think that potentially has really helped me, since I've sort of realized where I could have made a little more stops, like talking too fast. So I could realize that I would talk too fast when I was very nervous. And so, taking time to breathe, and then this relationship, how you talk about, the physical, the mental, that everything is holistic, right? Like even, so I think that those practical, small, but very practical steps really help. And now, I was teaching, I was presenting all of that, but now I think it's gotten a little better because, I don't know, I feel better. I feel confident.
Well, and I'm really impressed that I'm impressed with any non-native speaker who does this, but having seen you on stage and the work that you do, how have you been able to feel that anxiety, feel sometimes that language insecurity, and still keep pushing yourself? Because you're on stage and you're on boards, you're negotiating with city leaders, community leaders, and you're so mission driven. And so how have you been able to keep your eye on the prize and, I guess, overcome those insecurities in the moment?
It's a really good question. I think I had this sort of sense of purpose before, but I think when just, talking to you more and kind of like going deep into my own sense of insecurities and stuff, I've realized that focusing on the bigger purpose, right? Well, why am I doing this? I think that gives me a little more confidence that, sort of amplifying my voice for something better, for the larger good of the people or for the community, or, to elevate these voices that have not been heard in the field. That I think gives me much more power, and I do not then hesitate to speak. So I think just focusing on the bigger purpose, which you've sort of helped me to like kind of hone on that more. So it's I'll practice that every day. And so they say that in 21 days, you sort of like become that habit. So hopefully it's getting there.
That's why during the program every day, it was like, just keep doing it. By the end of the program, it'll become more ingrained. Oh, that makes me so happy to hear, because a lot of times it can be challenging, especially when we get into like not just executive presence, but virtual executive presence, how you present yourself on LinkedIn, how you present yourself non-verbally. It can be really uncomfortable if you perceive that as that's putting the spotlight on me and I don't want the spotlight. Some personalities love the spotlight and that's great, but a lot of times that can be uncomfortable. And then from a lifetime of when the spotlight is on me, people notice my accent, or, you know what I mean? Like other insecurities from the past.
Yeah, it can be. It used to be uncomfortable to have that attention, especially when speaking in groups, and you just have to shift that focus and again, the benefits and contributions that you bring to others. And then reminding myself that, sharing these ideas can impact discussions. And so that's that, like really concentrating on the potential value than your own discomfort. I think for me, that I find it easier to speak up and understand that this can make a difference.
Yes. Like when you focus on the impact and on the people that you'll help, sometimes that lets you like, oh, wait, my insecurities are not what needs to be holding me back right now. I have the opportunity. And you and I have talked a lot about not only being minorities in most of the rooms that we're in, but also the gender aspect, the difference in communication, not only culturally, but then you also have the gender differences and then the American differences. So it's really so multifaceted and multi-layered. Something that I thought was really powerful for you was learning how to interrupt. So can you tell me a little bit about how that's helped you show up in meetings differently?
I know it's been very interesting, because before I used to get very frustrated. It's like, what is this? I can't, like, you're trying to like raise hands, but nobody's looking at you. But I think, like, some of the videos that you shared and things that we've discussed, and how politely yet very confidently you can sort of pause people, let me pause you there for a minute and sort of like take that charge to focus on that discussion. That is, I practice that literally every day.
Good.
And yeah, there's been times where I'm the only woman of color in the room, and have to stay well prepared. If you have to get your point across, what are the ways in how you can do that, understanding both the gender, the culture, the language nuances, and all of those things. So I would say, like, really, like, seeking out mentors and allies, and Tanya, and like, just sort of like, provide the support and share experiences. It's been incredibly empowering, for sure.
Oh, it makes me so happy, because it's a big deal because you shared that sometimes you're also on boards where it's people from your culture, but it's men.
Yes.
And whether we want to, I don't believe in not acknowledging differences. Like it is what it is. And so being able to be in those rooms and have an executive presence that commands respect, and how to be diplomatic, and how to not be, because I find sometimes it can be confusing in it's not about being more masculine. It's about being yourself, but being it in the most confident, authoritative when needed, diplomatic when needed, persuasive when needed, like really leaning into, which is why when we start the program, like, it's about, who are you? First, you need to know who you are and who you want to be, so that then you can be that in different versions of yourself in different situations.
True, I agree. I think I've worked on developing that sense of self-belief, and I think the program has helped to challenge any doubts or imposter syndrome that arise over and over again across people.
Is imposter syndrome something that, like, in going through this process, did you identify, was it imposter syndrome? Or, because I find with non-native speakers, it can be a little bit confusing on, is it imposter syndrome or is it language insecurity? Like, for you, what do you feel? Was it 50-50? Was it more one or the other?
I think it was probably 50-50. You're right. Yeah, it is. And yeah, it creates like all kinds of doubts in yourself, and developing a strong sense of self-belief is important. And I think, like, even when, who are you, talking about the purpose and all of that, or so somehow there's this holistic approach to things, and learning that, that your differences are not obstacles, but they're strengths that can enrich, like, the group dynamic. And we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion all the times, but that's what it is also understanding that diversity that you bring are strengths, and that it can enrich the group dynamic. And I think once you start valuing yourself more, like, you sort of develop the confidence, and then I think that confidence sort of then helps you to speak more clearly, confidently, calmly, which is one of the things I think I have learned to do, is speak a bit slowly and so more calmly. Because yeah, when I used to get nervous, I used to speak very, very fast.
It makes a huge difference just to give yourself that time to breathe. I think something else with you touching upon DEI, diversity and equity and inclusion, it can be challenging when you do have, I find that having diverse perspectives is great. However, the challenge for the person who is the diversity is with communication, being able to communicate in a way that connects with people. And so I find that, for example, coming from certain cultures where you're more descriptive and flowery, this is where we're getting into the triangle method of you want to make an impact, but when you're communicating in a way that's counter to the culture that you're trying to connect with, as you may have experienced, you lose, whether it's opportunities, or you lose the opportunity for creating more empathy or sympathy. So how has it been for you realizing how important it is for American communication to get to the point first?
I know it's been a learning curve, and it's really been pushing me to be more concise and prioritize key information. Yeah, this is probably by far the triangle approach. I think that's by far the best thing I've learned.
It's so simple, but
I know it's so simple yet extremely difficult, because as a non-native English speaker, storytelling is very circular. background details leading up to the main point, but it's exactly different here in English speaking context. So very linear, direct. And I think the triangle approach has sort of helped me understand things more clearly myself and making it more concise and prioritize key information to others. So I that's definitely helped a lot to sort of enhance my communication skills, and also be aware of how different cultural norms shape storytelling. It's a continual process.
When you first have that realization, I find that most people's reactions are like, oh, that's why people kind of stop listening to me. Or you know what I mean? You can tell when you lose an audience's attention. You're like, oh, it wasn't my English at all. Your English is perfectly clear, but rather it's the vehicle, the story.
Right. And it's this is sort of even so funny now that I know this. When I'm even speaking with others and listening to something, I can totally tell, okay, not the triangle, it has to be the triangle.
But it's something so cool that you can catch, because before you didn't know, and I find that it feeds the language insecurity, because you immediately think, am I not speaking clearly enough? Is it what I'm saying? So now that you know, you're not only more confident about your English, but you realize like, oh, I can fix this. It doesn't matter where I am in my story. I can always pivot and make it concise again.
Right. But the cool thing with non-native English speakers is that this blend of approaches, right, absolutely enhances your communication skills. It makes you more versatile, and then also aware of different cultural norms of storytelling. So it's
and mindfulness.
Interesting. Yeah.
And because all day you're switching, right? The way that you're communicating with your students is very different than you communicating with city council members, where you have to be more persuasive, where you have to be more concise when you're doing a presentation. So, or for you, when you're going from, because you're still speaking English in these meetings with other people from Nepal. So then that's a kind of, okay, now I have to go back to the other storytelling, but do it in my native language. And so it's very interesting how often your brain has to be so malleable, so flexible to be able to adapt all day long. And I think that that's a wonderful muscle to exercise.
Right. And then honestly, like non-native English speaker, actually, it's so cool that we have that in us, that we're able to do that, you know.
Yeah, you get it on a much deeper level.
Right.
It's empathy, because you've experienced it. So you're like, okay, I get what it feels like. And this is when you understand the why. And I think you as being an academic, like it's so fascinating. The emotional, the why, the connection to where our parents are from. Like it's not just the moment. And so I think when you take those moments and you appreciate them, you dissect them a little bit, the results are so much faster later on when you need to adapt.
Absolutely.
So how would you say, circling back to work, how would you say that your experience as a non-native speaker has influenced your approach to research and to your academic life?
Great question. Definitely has shaped my approach to research and academic writing. I think I'm more aware of my own positionality, what I bring to the table as a South Asian immigrant woman from Nepal, and more sensitive to issues of diversity, equity, inclusion for sure. I've definitely have become more meticulous with language use, paying very close attention to style and clarity to ensure precision, persuasion, ease of understanding, but also making sure that my writing amplifies diverse voices. And I think, you know, the attention to detail, reviewing my work, it's also good to seek feedback from colleagues and mentors, sort of to catch any nuances or errors.
So being open and being vulnerable, being open and willing to
absolutely. The continuous learning, which I mentioned before, I think it's amazing. And, you know, understanding your strengths, understanding who you are as an academic. On top of that, you know, your own positionality, and not just as a South Asian immigrant woman, but also from Nepal, because South Asia can be this big region. And I often want to really make sure that I am from Nepal and other countries in South Asia that are more popular. Nepal is popular. And yeah.
But you amplify the voice, yeah.
Very few of us, Nepali academics in the US, I think in social work especially, I'm one of the less than 5 Nepali academics in the US. So I am more sensitive to that, and And that experience as a non-native English speaker with my own positionality, I think it makes me much more sensitive, in a good way, in sensitive to issues of all of these things, understanding that my writing matters, right? So I think it's made me much more open to learning from peers and colleagues.
Agree with you that being a non-native speaker, there is this experience where ego doesn't get in the way, oftentimes, not always, but ego doesn't get in the way as much as it does for a native speaker, because you know that you don't know everything. And because from a language perspective, you always know I can always improve my accent, I can always improve my structure, I can always improve my communication. It's ingrained in you that there is room for improvement. Whereas sometimes, and like in certain, once you get into levels of leadership in academia, the egos get bigger. It can be, that's where I think you see the difference between people who stop growing and let the ego say like, no, I'm good as I am, versus the leaders who are open and vulnerable and continue to grow and evolve. And I think those are the leadership styles that really make the greatest impact long term.
Right. No, absolutely. It's being curious, being compassionate, right? Curious because you are learning all the time, compassionate because the ego that you just mentioned, and also being courageous is what I'll also say, is that it gives you the courage to be more adventurous.
Yes, because it takes courage to admit you don't know something. It takes courage to ask, like, what did you say? What was that word? It really does. And so when you flex that muscle, I think it allows you to use that muscle in other bigger areas that maybe are not language related, which I find is conducive to bigger picture thinking.
Right.
Gathering more information. So what advice would you give to other people who are in similar professional and cultural positions? So think back when you first started your career, because right now you're way more established, you've gone through more. So I would even say, what advice would you give yourself when you first started your career?
Good question. My advice would be to, again, embrace continuous learning, regularly improve language skills, understand cultural nuances, because it's fun. It's fun as well to continue to learn. Seek feedback from peers, mentors, colleagues, right? And to sort of gain these diverse perspectives, because interpretations can be different and there's a continuous learning there too. Also be very patient to yourself and persistent, and then recognizing that, adapting again to a new language and cultural norms really takes time.
So what's a myth that you believed then that you now know isn't true, or was something you were telling yourself that was holding you back that now you know you didn't need to worry about?
Yeah, I think there's just this, I think for people, non-native English speakers, there's just this, like, the onus that we put on ourselves, the burden that we put on ourselves to, I think you just want to prove yourself continuously in many different levels. And so
a lot of pressure.
Is a lot of pressure, right? So sort of like being unburdened by some of these pressure that you create, because that creates a lot of limitations, I think is very important. And again, focusing on clarity and simplicity and in communication. And this is particularly for academics, avoiding jargons so that your message is very accessible. I think that I have to remind myself that a lot. And
tell me more about that. What do you mean because that's really good language tips for somebody in that position.
I know. So like academics, we use a lot of like technical, big academic languages that people don't understand. And it's, just use it in academic research writing. And so that's why there's a big gap between academia and practice. So understanding, right, like avoiding those jargons, because your message and communication needs to be clear, simple, accessible. That's important. I'm sort of a community engaged researcher, so that over time I have learned to do that. How do you translate research into practice that's useful and meaningful to policymakers and stakeholders? So I think this will apply in other fields as well, in other technical fields. So making sure that, you avoid the jargons and to really present these complex ideas in very simple terms. I think that's important. And then learning those skills, I think, the communication skills that Hania tells you, that's very important.
That I'm texting you, simplify.
I know, simplify this, clarity, but at the same time, focus on the strengths that you bring in.
And from an English perspective, you bring up a really great point that I understand, especially for academics, the writing skills are so much more elevated and proficient. For them to know what I wish you would have known maybe back then is that the pressure is so much less when it comes to speaking. So write as wonderfully as you can, but the value is more on simplify to amplify. It's really about using casual grammar, casual words in a way that people can relate to them better. Less pressure.
Right. Absolutely. So, there's this, when I started enrolled in the coaching program, I wasn't really sure. I had been dealing with a lot of these things, and I share with Tanya all the time. I was like, there's got to be something for non-native English speakers. And so I found Tanya and I enrolled myself, and it's been very, very good. I think it has elevated my self-confidence. I find myself speaking in meetings very confidently, asking questions, feeling more comfortable to ask questions. So it's been valuable. And the other thing, just with the nature of my job, I teach. And so that specific section on persuasion, that was very, very pragmatic to what I do. And so that was also extremely valuable.
And that's an interesting thing that as a takeaway, because obviously not everybody can have the time or be able to invest in certain training. In order to simplify to amplify, I think a really interesting practice, whether you're in academia or in a different field, and it's a method that you can do, but I would refine it in try to think of a message. And it could be as simple as describing your favorite movie. Describe it to your best friend. Right. Describe it to someone who hates that movie genre. Describe it to a child. And you just start flexing that muscle of how do you change the messaging depending on the audience. And then you can take that a step further. If you're an engineer, how would you describe cloud computing to a teenager? How would you describe cloud computing to a peer? And so that's going to help you, because it's easy to say, like, just simplify. But as you know, it is much easier said than done, because not only are you trying to translate the simplicity, because sometimes I feel like you might switch to your native language when you're trying to process all that. And so you have to feel that. You have to catch it. Of like, am I translating again? How can I improve that process to be faster, to be simpler? And so really practicing in low pressure situations so that you can do it. For example, for you, being able to explain it in a presentation, but then when you have Q&A with the community, you have to switch up the way that you present that exact same information in the same hour. Mm-hmm. So that would be something I would recommend is take it on your own. I would even recommend recording yourself, because when you hear it, you're like, what am I doing?
I know. So this was the only time, because you don't want to hear yourself, right? So we're doing all these exercises. I was like, oh, okay, this is where I did not do this. And yeah,
it's so clear. When you hear it and you allow yourself, and really when you know what you're looking for, because it's not just record or record. It's record, and then like we're looking for certain strategies. You hear how easily you could make a couple of changes and then the message is clear. I find that the results, you can implement it. It's not theoretical. It's really pragmatic. Like you said, it's use it immediately the next day.
Absolutely. And I think for most time, the reason we don't hear ourselves is because we avoid being too critical, rather than taking it a little more positively and saying, this is a continuous process. Let me hear this. Let me make these course corrections. And so that was probably the first time I ever went back and heard myself, but I'm glad I did.
Yeah, so recording yourself, it'll feel like torture at first, but it speeds up the process. And I do this with every client, and it can be as simple as recording one sentence per day. It just frees you from the fear. No one's going to criticize you like you criticize yourself.
That's true. That's the other thing. People are not thinking that hard. Yeah. And I do see that with a grain of salt, because, there are things where people do, receive you in a different light if you look different, talk different. All of that is there. But I think even then, to finding comfort and, feeling comfortable to who you are and what you're speaking, I think that's important. It definitely gives a lot of confidence.
Yeah, and it helps you see that oftentimes, and I get what you're saying, like there's always going to be a certain level somewhere of discrimination. So it's not about, there's nothing we can do about that. But I find that when there is, I would say, someone's hesitant to work with someone from a different culture or country, when the fear is that it's my accent that they don't like, in my experience, it's not the accent, it's the clarity in the messaging. And now that you see, like, once you realize, oh, my structure is overly complicated, so they don't understand me. It's not your English, it's that they don't understand your message. That's something you can work on. And it's so empowering when you realize it's not about my culture. It's not even about my accent. It's about communication. I find that to be liberating in a very empowering way.
Completely agree. And it's almost now, and I'm definitely, I have an accent and I'm comfortable with that because that's who I am.
Yeah. It's not about the accent, it's the clarity.
Right. It is the clarity and it's the communication style, the way you present. I think that makes a lot of difference.
And there are certain moments where, sure, if and that ties back to clarity, right? Where if a certain sound isn't coming out clearly and it's a high frequency sound that you need, for example, the TH in American English or the R, if it's causing confusion, then great. You work on that sound for the particular words that you have. But a lot more often than not at this level, it's about intonation, it's about confidence in delivery, and it's simplifying the structure of the message. So I find that a lot of times non-native speakers in leadership positions, you don't know where to put your effort. You don't know where to, like, what is it that I'm doing that is holding me back from those higher positions or those moments, which is hopefully what you were able to discover working together and feel unburdened by now.
Absolutely. I feel much better for sure. I was doing these things. I felt it was in the right trajectory, but I definitely needed some assistance. And I think the program really helped me a lot to understand where I was coming from, what are some of the things I could improve upon. And that has been very helpful. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for spending this time with us. Make sure that you follow Arati on LinkedIn to learn more about academia and social work. And if you're interested to sign up in the program that Arati's talking about during the interview, head over to tanyasuarez.com/leadership. And remember to like, subscribe, and comment to let me know who else you would like me to interview to learn more about their leadership English journey.